Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Tales from the Crypt Presents Demon Knight. Now, Tales from the Crypt Presents Demon Knight is the first film in a trilogy of spin-off movies of the television series Tales from the Crypt. Now, I have Demon Knight on the same DVD as the movie Bordello of Blood, which is the second film in the trilogy. Now, before I talk about this movie, I want to talk a little bit about the TV series in which this movie is based. Now, Tales from the Crypt was a TV series that aired on HBO from 1989 to, I think, 1995. The series lasted 7 seasons, and I actually have all 7 seasons on DVD. Now, I'm a huge fan of the show Tales from the Crypt, and at the end of this review, I'm actually going to name off what my top 15 favorite episodes of the show were, but we won't get to that till we get to the end of this review. Now, Tales from the Crypt, of course, was based on the EC comic book series of the same name, as well as the 1972 horror film of the same name. Now, each episode of the series was a different story, and each episode was narrated by this wisecracking zombie called the Crypt Keeper. And the character of the Crypt Keeper really has become a horror icon now. And this show actually had episodes that were directed by some pretty big-name directors like Robert Zemeckis, Joel Silver, Walter Hill, and Richard Donner were also the main producers for the show, and you had an episode of the show that was directed by William Friedkin, who also directed The Exorcist. You had some pretty big-name directors attached to this show, and some pretty big-name actors as well. Like, you had people like William Sadler, Billy Zane, Joe Pesci, and even Arnold Schwarzenegger actually directed an episode of this show, and there was also an episode of this show that was directed by Tom Hanks, and that episode actually had an appearance from Tom Hanks, and there was also an episode that was directed and starring Michael J. Fox. Like, you also had episodes that starred Steve Buscemi and Daniel Craig. You had a lot of really big, like, mainstream directors and actors attached to this show. So, with the success of the TV series, in 1995 they ended up making this movie. Now, this movie, as I said, was the first of a trilogy of Tales from the Crypt spin-off movies. Now, each film in this trilogy is a standalone movie that just happens to be narrated by the Crypt Keeper. Now, this movie, to be honest, is definitely the best of the trilogy, and I freaking love this movie. And honestly, this movie really could have worked as its own movie, not even connected to the Tales from the Crypt franchise. Like, I actually think this is a genuinely good horror comedy film. Now, the plot of Demon Knight is, it's essentially like Night of the Living Dead, but with demons instead of zombies, but it does have a very Night of the Living Dead-esque kind of premise to it. Essentially, the movie is about this man named Frank Breaker, played by William Sadler, who, in the beginning of the movie, is on the run from this character who is referred to in the movie as the Collector, and the Collector is played by Billy Zane, and it turns out that this man called the Collector is actually a demon in human form, and this man named Frank Breaker has actually been chosen by God to protect this key, which is actually filled with the blood of Christ, and it turns out that if the Collector gets his hands on this key, it will essentially be the end of the world. Like, he will be able to open the gates of hell, and demons will will take over the Earth. So what happens in the movie is Frank Breaker ends up at this hotel, which actually used to be a church, and what happens is the Collector follows him there, and then the Collector summons an army of demons, and so now Frank Breaker and a bunch of other people are trapped in this church while all the demons are outside trying to get their hands on this key. And of course, if they get their hands on the key, it will be the end of the world. And in order to keep the demons out, Frank uses some of the blood that's in the key to create like a magic seal around all the doors and windows to keep the demons out. And that's the basic plot line of Demon Knight, and of course, since it's a Tales from the Crypt movie, you have an opening and closing to the movie that is narrated by the Crypt Keeper. Now, I love Demon Knight. Like, this is honestly one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and as I said, this movie really could have stood on its own, not even as a movie that's connected to the Tales from the Crypt series, because this is a really, really good movie, and I think it's a criminally underrated movie, and the movie has some pretty big-name actors in it. Like, of course, it has William Sadler as the main hero, and it has Billy Zane as the main villain, but it also has Jada Pinkett in it, and Dick Miller, who I always known best from movies like Gremlins and A Bucket of Blood, and it also has Thomas Haden Church and C.C.H. Pounder. It has a lot of really big names in this, and all the acting in the movie is really good, and all the characters are very interesting and very likable. Like, the characters in the movie, they all have kind of like quirky personalities, but the characters in the movie are very likable and are very interesting characters, and it's a genuinely good horror film. Now, it is a horror comedy, like, there's definitely humor in the movie, and but it's a movie I highly, highly recommend. And the character of Frank Breaker is a genuinely interesting character. Like, I would have loved to have seen them make a sequel to this movie, actually continuing the story of this movie. I mean, obviously they wouldn't have done that, because the whole point of Tales from the Crypt is it's an anthology series, so each movie has to be a different story, but I would have loved to have seen this story get continued somehow. Like, I really, really enjoy this film. And also, I love William Sadler. I think he's a criminally underrated actor. And this movie actually has a really kick-ass soundtrack as well. I actually have the soundtrack on audio tape, actually, but the soundtrack for this movie is actually really, really good. You could definitely tell it came out in the early 90s. Like, you have a lot of early 90s music in this, but the music really does fit the tone of the movie. Like, the movie opens up with the song by Filter, "Hey Man, Nice Shot," and it's a really, really badass opening, but this movie, it's awesome. It has a great soundtrack. It's a genuinely funny and scary horror comedy, and as I said, it's a good movie. I highly, highly recommend this movie. Now I want to name off what my top 15 favorite episodes of the TV show are. Number 15 is the episode Yellow, which is an episode from Season 3 of the show, and this is such a great episode. Now, this episode does stand apart from the other episodes of the series because this one is actually not a horror story. This one is actually a war drama. Basically, the plot of this episode is it's set during World War I, and it's about a soldier who doesn't want to be in the army, and it turns out that his cowardice ends up getting some men killed, so now he's about to be executed, but the person who's ordering his execution is actually his father. This is such an amazing episode, though. Even though it's not horror, it's still a great episode, and it has some genuinely moving performances. The episode stars Kirk Douglas as his father, and the main character of the episode is played by Eric Douglas, who is actually Kirk Douglas's son. But it's a great episode, and it also has Lance Hendrickson in it and Dan Aykroyd, and the episode is directed by Robert Zemeckis, who also directed movies like Forrest Gump. Number 14 on my list is an episode called Undertaken Paler, and this is a really, really fun episode. This episode is about a group of kids who have to stop an evil mortician, and that's all I want to say about the episode, but this is a really, really just fun episode. It's actually almost like a darker, more fucked up version of the Goonies. Number 13 on my list is an episode from Season 2 called The Switch, which stars William Hickey as this old man who is in love with this like 20 or 30-something-year-old woman, and in order to win her over, he ends up getting this, like, radical surgery that causes him to actually switch bodies with another person. That's all I want to say about the episode, but this episode, I shit you not, is directed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, and in the beginning of the episode, where you have the Crypt Keeper introducing the story, Arnold Schwarzenegger is there. It's a really, really fun episode. Number 12 on my list is an episode from Season 6 called 99 and 44 100% Pure Horror, and this episode is about a woman who's an artist who murders her husband, who is the president of this soap company. That's all I want to say about the episode, but this episode has one of the goriest and grossest freaking endings I think I've seen in any of the episodes of this show. But it's a really good episode, and I highly recommend it. Number 11 on the list is an episode from Season 2 called Cormans Calamity, and this is a really, really funny episode. In this episode, it's about a comic book artist who is actually a comic book artist for Tales from the Crypt, and it turns out that anything he draws comes to life. It's a really, really just fun episode. It's not meant to be taken seriously at all, but it's a really fun episode, and I highly recommend this one. Number 10 on my list is another episode from Season 2 called For Crying Out Loud, which is another very funny episode. It's about a music promoter who plans on stealing a lot of money, but then he starts to hear his conscience for the first time. That's all I want to say about this episode. But in the episode, Iggy Pop is actually in this, and he actually plays himself in the episode. Number 9 is another episode from Season 2 called Fitting Punishment. You're gonna notice that most of the episodes I put on this list are actually episodes from Season 2, because Season 2 is actually my favorite season of the whole series, but the episode Fitting Punishment is about this kid who goes to live with his uncle after his parents are killed, and his uncle is an undertaker, but his uncle is extremely abusive towards him, and his uncle is just a complete dirtbag, and I don't want to give away what happens, but his uncle does get a comeuppance at the end of the story. Number 8 is the episode Lower Birth, and this episode is about this deformed man with two faces who is a freak at a circus, and he ends up falling in love with a mummy. And this episode is interesting because this episode is also an origin story for the Crypt Keeper. In this, you find out how the Crypt Keeper was born. This episode is also written by Fred Deckard, who also directed movies like The Monster Squad and Night of the Creeps, and the episode is directed by Kevin Yeager, who is the same person who designed the puppet for the Crypt Keeper, and he also designed the puppet for Chucky in the Child's Play movies. Number 7 is the ventriloquist dummy, and this is a really, really creepy episode, but also a very funny episode as well, and I don't want to say much about the plotline of this one, but this is a really, really good episode, and the episode is directed by Richard Donner, who also directed movies like The Omen and Superman, and the episode is written by Frank Darabont, who also co-wrote the screenplay for A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, and the 1988 remake of The Blob, and he also wrote and directed movies like The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. Number 6 on my list is an episode from Season 1 called The Man Who Was Death, and this is about an executioner actually played by William Sadler, and this executioner, he gets laid off, so he essentially becomes a vigilante and starts killing people who he views as being guilty of murder, and in the episode he constantly breaks the fourth wall and actually starts talking to the audience. It's a really, really good episode, and the episode is directed by Walter Hill. Number 5 on my list is an episode from Season 2 called Four-Sided Triangle, and basically this is about this young woman played by Patricia Arquette who is more or less being kept as a slave by these two people, a husband and wife, and the husband really does have a thing for Patricia Arquette's character, but in the movie, or in the episode, Patricia Arquette's character starts to fall in love with a scarecrow, and that's all I want to say about this episode. But the episode is actually directed by Tom Holland, who directed movies like Child's Play and Fright Night. Number 4 on my list is an episode called Television Terror, and this is about this sleazy TV host who ends up doing a special where he goes into a haunted house, and it turns out the house actually is haunted. And I always used to love this episode when I was younger, but now I kind of relate to the episode a little bit more because I actually know people who work in the television industry, and I've taken TV production classes in college, so I feel like I kind of relate to this episode a little bit more. But this is a really fun episode. It's a really funny episode, but also a genuinely creepy episode as well. Number 3 is another episode from Season 2 called Three's a Crowd, and this is such a freaking depressing episode. Basically, it's about this guy who is really paranoid, and he thinks his wife is cheating on him, and my god, this has one of the most depressing freaking endings to an episode I've ever seen, and it's like, most of the Tales from the Crypt episodes are kind of like horror comedies, but this one is actually dead serious, but it's a really good episode, and it's highly recommended. Number 2 on my list is an episode from Season 4 called On a Dead Man's Chest, and this is one of the episodes that I actually first saw when I was a little kid. Like, I first saw this when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, and this episode scared the living hell out of me. But basically the episode is about this rock musician who really hates the wife or fiancé of his best friend, and later on in the episode, he ends up getting a tattoo, but the tattoo artist doesn't tell him the tattoo he's given him, and it turns out that the tattoo is of this woman that he really hates, and that's all I want to say about the episode. But this episode really did scare the living hell out of me when I was a little kid, and the episode is actually directed by William Friedkin, who also directed The Exorcist. And my number 1 favorite episode of Tales from the Crypt is and All Through the House. Now, in All Through the House was an episode from Season 1, and this is actually a remake of one of the segments from the original Tales from the Crypt movie from 1972. Now, this episode is written by Fred Deckard and is directed by Robert Zemeckis, and basically the episode is about a woman who murders her husband in order to get the insurance money, and then a serial killer dressed as Santa Claus starts going after her. But this was always one of my favorite episodes of the whole show, and I actually watch this episode every so often around Christmas time, and I actually did a short film that you could watch here on YouTube called The Nutcracker, and the opening of that short film was basically a parody on the opening of this episode. But if you want, definitely check out that short film. It's on this YouTube channel. Just type in, go to my YouTube channel and type in The Nutcracker, and you should be able to find that. But if you've seen this episode and if you watched that short film, the opening of that short film, as I said, was basically a parody on the opening of this episode. So yeah, that's my review on Demon Knight / my top 15 favorite Tales from the Crypt episodes, and bye.